first video, I'm going to talk about just kind of an introduction to the Tao Te Ching and the reasoning behind like what the Tao is. And then in the next video, I'll talk about kind of the societal implications of following the Tao. So Taoism is expressed in its kind of main founding book, the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching was written by Lazy, who is referred to as kind of the old master of it. And it's kind of a reaction to the rigid structure and order of Confucian society. So Taoism has kind of different versions of it, but it's a rejection of that social order and those hierarchies and having this intense authority. It's really about embracing spontaneity and non-action, or wu wei. It's about embracing the Tao, which is referred to as the path. And then De means to obtain kind of this virtue. And then Jing is basically like how this can be translated in a scripture, in a book, in a text that people can understand. So Tao, again, is the way, the path, the principle, the kind of the underlying principle of reality. And then De is kind of how one can obtain this path of virtue. And then Jing is the scripture or the text that describes these ideas. So Tao Te Ching, just like with Buddhism and the Dhammapada, focuses on embracing change. Change and spontaneity are pretty much the only constants in life. So how can we embrace it? How can we be open to it? We should not be imposing things. We shouldn't be obsessed with creating a social order. It's more of a philosophy of doing rather than doing, which is kind of, I mean, I think especially in Western culture, we're like, what the heck does that mean? Like, how do you not do things? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you become like apathetic and you just don't care or you give up, but it's more about how we cannot force or impose our will upon things. So it's about like embracing quietness as a virtue. It's not about excessively talking. It's about recognizing that certain things are out of our control and that we can just kind of contemplate what happened, but not become so obsessed with it and not become so obsessed with the fact that we can't control everything. Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, is descriptive and prescriptive. So it's descriptive because it's explaining metaphysically how reality is, but it's also prescriptive because it's describing how we should be doing, right? It's an ethical call to action or non-action, but it's descriptive because it's saying this is how the way is, this is how nature is, but it's also prescriptive because it's saying this is what you should or should not be doing based off of how things are. And if you think that Buddhism was a really kind of open, fluid philosophy, well, Taoism gets even more open and even more fluid because it's all about embracing the natural kind of ways of things and embracing non-action. The Tao, it's all about following this Tao, following this path, following this principle. The Tao is something that's describable and indescribable. It embodies contradictions. It embodies yin and yang. It embodies opposition. It exists in everything. It's present everywhere, right? It's kind of omnipresent. There really isn't a god or a deity here, right? But the Tao is kind of this force that exists, and it's everywhere and all around us. And in the Tao Te Ching, they refer to this sage or this wise person. And the sage is, in chapter 49, they talk about how the sage or the wise person is someone who followed the path. They weren't born that way. Anyone can be a sage or a wise person, just like anyone can be a Buddha, because it's based off of how you're living. So they do not desire, they're not focused on materialism, which again is similar to Buddhism. And they're not focused on that which they cannot have. So we see that theme all throughout the Tao Te Ching, that to be wise, to be a sage, is to embrace the Tao, and it's to embrace that nothingness and that wu wei of non-action. So when it comes to how our reality is created, the Tao is a starting point of reality. Everything comes from the Tao. It is meaningless and meaningful. It's hidden, it's empty, it's fluid. It's kind of similar to a transcendental reality where it's sublime, it's something that's unknown, it's not really understood. It's like the uncarved wood, which is a theme we see in the Tao Te Ching, where think about what it means to carve a wood, right? You're inserting something into a piece of wood and changing its shape. You're changing its form. You're changing its relation to the rest of the wood. So let the wood be uncarved. Let the wood be the way it is. Let the wood be the way it naturally is. Embrace that type of simplicity. Embrace that natural kind of way of how things are. And with Taoism and the Tao, it's okay to not understand what the Tao is. It's okay to not fully comprehend it because it may be incomprehensible, right? We can't necessarily understand how something works when it's so omnipresent, when it exists everywhere. And that's why we can't force things constantly, right? Talking too much is an example of how something can be forceful and exhausting, right? How many of you have dealt with that person where you've met them somewhere, or it's someone you know, right, where they just talk your ear off and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted from them, right? And I think that is a funny application in the Tao Te Ching, where someone who's imposing their will so much, someone who's just like talking your ear off constantly, is exhausting. It's okay to go against materialism. It's not good to focus on on what you have versus what you don't have. It's embracing that struggle against the ruling class materialism that was prevalent at the time. And I think part of the tension here too with Taoism is that language isn't meant to describe it. There's kind of a critique of language here, because language can require us or can lead us to desire things we don't necessarily naturally desire. So the Tao then is about the totality and the particularity of everything, kind of the general and the specific. It's all about change, just like with Buddhism. It's all about embracing that change, that impermanence that's happening. So they say to be like water in chapter 8, to kind of go with the flow, to recognize that things are changing. There is also no self, like there is with Buddhism, right? There is anatma, no self. So respect and love the world as you love and respect yourself. Think about yourself as being connected to the universe in the way Brahman is connected to the universe with Hinduism and the self. Recognize that also the body is transient. It changes constantly. So we can't necessarily trust it all the time. It feels like a cage, and it's confusing. But recognize that the Tao is self-sufficient. The Tao just exists regardless of what you're doing. So those were kind of the main ideas with the Tao Te Ching I want to talk about, and I'll continue to describe the Tao with respect to its societal implications.